Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. This is a classroom session today. A little bit about where the game has transitioned from in the last 6 to 8 months and why tanks as a class have gotten worse over that time span. Now, my definition of tanks, the one generally accepted in much of the higher ranks here, is that anything with innate hate or can generate hate on turn 1 is a tank. Anything else that can't do that is basically a pseudo tank. So if you have Taunting Blade or something, that's what it counts as. So that's essentially how we define tanks in the broad balance of the game. But many of you have probably noticed over those past 6 months, you've seen less and less of those characters in many of the teams that are present, at least at the top end of the game, top 25 Guild Wars or so. And this is a theory as to why. So let's talk about why tanks right now have less value, comparatively so. Now, the level of penetration that existed in the game has vastly diminished their overall bulkiness compared to what it used to be, and how that really affects the concept of effective HP as we know it. I'm going to talk about that in depth in a moment here. The dispel on top tier characters, and not even necessarily top tier, but really most characters you see used more often than not, have neutered much of their strengths when it comes to how they generate hate, generate defense and spirit buffs, and generate other buffs. If you can dispel all of that, it vastly takes away some of their innate advantages that they used to have more consistently. Now, not all of them also have the newer tools necessary to survive in what we see in the current state of the game when it comes to barriers and courage and re-raise and self-heal and other things of that nature. Things that are becoming more and more intricate into the flow of battle. But that being said, innate hate is still the best thing about them, and that innate hate concept cannot be understated. The ability to dictate how enemy AI moves and how your own AI moves is literally the difference between good teams and bad teams in terms of consistency and how you win when it comes to arena and guild wars and any other kind of PvP content, at least from an auto perspective. And I just have to emphasize once again, this is not a video about tanks being bad or unusable. It's not the case. Just why they're relatively worse and why you may not see them used as often as you used to. So let's talk about effective HP first of all as a concept. It normalizes an HP pool to include resistances so that it's really less so health points, but more like the amount of damage you need to do to potentially kill someone. Resists are a major factor when it comes to survivability, right? Well, the calculation to getting to that, and this is just for kind of some of the math nerds out there to understand it better, it's the health points, and then you divide it by a couple different variables here, depending upon the attack that you're receiving. In a physical attack instance here, you essentially input the defense stat, and then the weapon resistance out of whatever weapon type attack it is. The result is the character's effective HP against those kinds of attacks. So the denominator inputs here change depending upon what kind of attacks you're receiving. When I do my analyses, I put all 5 different attacks in here. And theoretically, when it comes to effective HP, AoE resist, unit resist, and elemental resist is also in there, but those are typically non-penetratable, so I'm just going to eliminate them for the sake of noise in this presentation. But as an example, physical slash damage scales off defense and slash resistance. Magic missile damage, like Jaden, scales off spirit and missile resistance. So those are what you would put into the denominator here. And effective HP is only one part of a unit's survivability and their usefulness. So although it is an important thing to keep in mind, that is definitely not the end-all be-all to whether or not a character is good or strong or useful or whatever adjective you want. Barriers, self-heal, the utility of their abilities, their AI and how smart they are and what they do for consistency on certain kinds of maps, courage and re-raise, whole bunch of other things that contribute to a unit's survivability and how they potentially perform in battle. So let's look at an example which may kind of surprise some of you at first glance. We're going to look at Engelbert and Freyevia, and I chose the two of them just as kind of like general stress tests. It's not an indication whether they're good or not. It's really just looking at Engelbert, who's known as the bulkiest tank in the game, at least stereotypically so, and Freyevia, who is also known as kind of like a weaker overall tank in the game. And we're going to look at them from an effective HP perspective here, and we're going to weight all 5 of the weapon type resists equally. Now, this is obviously subject to whatever analysis you want to do. When I do my reviews, I actually don't weight all 5 weapon types equally because they're not all equally common. I give more weight to slash res, missile res, and magic res. I basically omit strike altogether. So there's a couple different ways you can think about this, but just for the sake of math, we're going to include all 5 equally. Now, Engelbert has 7,093 HP innately, and with passives, he also has 39 defense, 0 spirit, and then for resist, it's the 20 on slash, 50 on pierce, 25 strike, 20 missile, minus 30 magic. When you put all of these factors into that equation formula, you get effective HP of 12,455. Now, if we look at Freyevia, less HP at 6465, no defense or spirit innately or in the passives, 15 slash res, minus 5 to pierce and strike, 5 to missile, and 69% magic resistance for overall effective HP of 95-16. So there's a pretty good gap and what you see between the two of them for effective HP, but that's really not what ends up happening in practice nowadays. That's because penetrations have become so common. So 50% defense and spirit at a minimum is very common now. Most characters, so damage dealers, have that as a passive, and at least a minimum of 10 on a trust stone, if not more via vision cards and who knows what else. 50% slash res pen, also extremely common, if not more. 18% missile resistance could be a little bit higher or lower, but that's a pretty average number there, given what you have for a sub-vision card slot, if you were to put the 35% sub-vision card there. And 20% magic resistance penetration, also kind of common. So, given that these are more prevalent and more common in almost every battle that you see, these stats need to be, mentally adjusted for. So if we were to rethink this is still what they have here, but if we apply those former penetrations to these numbers, what changes? Well, for Engelbert, his 39 defense really is only 19 defense, so it's not nearly as high as it is initially. His 20 slash res is really only 10. His 20 missile resistance is really only 16 for a net effective HP of 9301. Pretty big difference from the initial 12,455. And we look at Fryevia. Well, she doesn't have any innate defense or spirit, so that doesn't change at all. The slash res goes from 15 to 7, but now the gap between Engelbert and Fryevia is not nearly as large there. Missile resist only goes down 1 from 5 to 4, and the magic resistance goes down from 69 to 55. Overall effective HP, 8,073. The main takeaway here, though, is that the gap in survivability between the two of them is much closer because of penetrations. And that's not just comparing between tanks, but as we're going to see in a second here, we're also going to compare tanks to just general damage dealers at this point. So the innate bulkiness that we think of many tanks is definitely reduced nowadays because of those penetrations. Now let's look at debuffs, and I use Charlotte as an example because she's one of the tanks that suffers the most potentially. She will, in a perfect world, use 2 buffs to start the fight here. The first is a track wall, where she generates hate of 12. She also gets defense and spirit debuff resistance for 3 turns, as well as all element debuff resistance for 3 turns as well. She'll also get 20 defense and spirit, and protect, shell, and regen. Well, let's say she uses those 2 buffs, and then bam, the first enemy attack is a dispel on her, not uncommon at all. What is left? It gets rid of all the top of these buffs, and she's left literally with only protect, shell, and regen. Now, that's still good, but that's obviously way less in terms of overall survivability than what she initially had pre-dispel. That being the case, if Charlotte's overall survivability is now neutered a little bit, not only from dispels and penetrations, let's look at Charlotte versus Esther as a comparison, and we're going to continue to use the penetration in these calculations. Well, Charlotte starts off 5,800 HP, no defense, 6 spirit, 5 slash resistance, minus 10 to pierce, minus 5 to strike, 8 missile, 16 magic, overall effective HP, 6,132. Let's put Esther in here side by side. Now, Esther has less HP, 4,734, but she's got 9 defense, no spirit. And the resists are kind of comparable in different ways. So 12 slash res, 25 pierce, 15 strike, 8 missile, minus 15 to magic. The overall effective HP, 5,748, not that far off from where Charlotte is, only about 300 less here. And there's more to still consider, right? Because Charlotte does have Protect and Shell, right? That does retain after being dispelled. But Esther's also got a 50% physical barrier. Now, we're not going to include regen in this. That does affect things a little bit for Charlotte, but it gets messy. But if we look at versus physical attacks, Charlotte's effective HP and how it mitigates 25 extra % damage, it's really 8,178, but Charlotte doubles. It's 11,496. So Esther versus physical attacks is way tankier than Charlotte is overall. And then versus magic attacks, yes, Esther definitely shows some of her weakness here, staying at 5748, whereas Charlotte still has that innate 8176. But it's one of those things where the best defense is the good offense, where Esther does so much more damage than Charlotte, while not giving up a ton of overall tankiness, other than against some magic damage. But again, that can be resisted via a variety of ways for Esther, that the gap between them is greatly diminished from what it may have been in the past. Now, you do need to compensate for the loss of initial hate. That's, again, the most important thing about a tank, but there are ways to do it. Theoretically, number 1, you could put Esther in slot 1 to start the fight to at least get a little bit of a hate advantage. Number 2, this is where like AI and toggles and movement all becomes very important, and it's really not like a teachable thing in a presentation, but if you design your comp so that Esther is in closer range and has movement that distances herself from the team so that enemies will target her before your backline, that's another way to get around it. Or theoretically, even something like the Vow of Love subvision card will give Esther hate. So there's ways to still get around some of dictating that initial movement of the enemy. Obviously, doesn't last as long as Charlotte, but theoretically, if Charlotte's getting her hate dispelled, she only has 5 hate. So it's not like there's a ton of hate that Esther is missing out on. So the overall conclusion, The video is not that tanks are bad. I don't want that to be misconstrued at all. There's plenty of tanks that you still see used all the time in all places for a variety of reasons. But lots of tanks lose much of their tanking advantage due to these penetrations and the dispel. There's essentially a lot of role compression between damage dealers and tanks, where the gap between their survivability isn't as far as it used to be. And that's why in my reviews recently, there's an extra emphasis on other forms of survivability. Now let's look at some recent walls in the top 10, just to kind of like highlight exactly what I'm talking about in terms of why some of this has shifted. Steel Wings in the past week has run 2 different kinds of walls here. This dark wall is Dark Fina, Stern, and Leela. Well, Fina's got re-raise, Stern has a barrier, Leela's got courage and a self-heal. They also have evasion to dodge attacks. There's also some curative potential in there. They also used a team of Lightning, Ibarra, and Resnick, where Lightning has a general barrier, Ibarra has a physical barrier. Resnick can apply a general barrier to either of them and heal up those tankier health pools as they take less damage overall. Salt has been running Joker, Fina, and Dark Lucia. Now Lucia's also got that barrier, a ton of AoE resistance. Joker's got Protect. Sin was running Jaden, Elena, and Locke. You're seeing Courage, Re-Raise, overall evasion. Lucavi is running Snow with the double archers. And again, Snow is kind of impervious to much of these downsides we were talking about, where he's got the most innate hate in the game that can't be dispelled. And he's got enough effective HP via the Courage and the self-heal that his health pool is really like 1.5 times the size of what it is on paper because of that self-heal, unless you have healing power down. Dead Guard, same concept. Chocoboss, same concept. Rhapsody, same concept. They're using the Haste ability here to double up on their offensive potency to kill things before they got killed. Dead Society, same idea. And even VIP, we've been using Sylvie, Elena, and Jaden with the idea of Sylvie having the barrier, some of the heals, and then some of the evasion that you get from Light. So overall, you're seeing the transition away from tanks at the top end of the game as some of these new characters come out, as some of the game balance changes. And so tanks have gotten progressively worse over that time. And it's something that I don't think enough people think about or know about. And it's something that I at least wanted to bring some attention to and talked through a little bit about the theory as to why. So hopefully this was something to think about a little further when you guys make your teams, when you see enemy teams, and how you build and what you think of as strong and not strong. But per usual, any comments, critiques, criticism, things you want clarified, all in the comment section below. Happy to talk things through on a topic that's very complex and not always that intuitive. So thanks for watching anyways. I'll talk to you all soon.